This video is for students who want some guidance on or elaboration of Day 16 of Unit 4, which focuses on the question, what was the major social impact of the Great Migration? In particular, I'm going to expand on a phrase that comes up fairly regularly when we study history, as well as being a major part of this lesson, which is push and pull factors. Let's begin with reviewing what the Great Migration was. On this slide, we can see the definition provided by Encyclopedia Britannica that informs us that this was a widespread movement of African Americans in the 20th century from rural communities in the South to large cities in the North and West. To learn more about this lesson calls for us to read and review a variety of sources, specifically maps and a video by Professor Davarian Baldwin. The culminating activity of this lesson is to apply the content we learned towards writing a short essay question similar to the one that's on the Regents, where we're going to be given two primary sources, and then we will discuss the historical circumstances that led to the events depicted in them, as well as identify and explain the relationship that exists between them. Before getting into our focus of push and pull factors, it would help if we put the Great Migration into perspective, and the first two maps that we're going to look at really do a great job of this. The first one, which is called the Great Migration 1916 to 1930, displays the three migration corridors, or pathways, most commonly used by African Americans during this time. I find this particularly interesting because it shows how truly vast this was on a geographic scale. I think when most students think of the Great Migration, they automatically think of places like Harlem and Chicago, but clearly there were dozens more cities that saw this influx of people moving out of the South. This next map really adds to our understanding of the Great Migration because of the graphs that it includes. All show a change in the population of African Americans between the same 3 years, between 1900, 1910, and then 1920. A minute ago, I said that Chicago, which you see over here, and New York, up in the top right-hand corner, are two of the most well-known destinations. And it is true, both saw tremendous increases. But take a look at some of the other northern cities, like in particular, take a look at Detroit over here. Up until 1910, the African American population was well below 10,000. Judging from this graph, it was probably even below 5,000. But just 10 years later, it exploded to nearly 50,000. Cleveland, over here, also experienced a similar trend. Now that we have some ideas of the end results, let's examine the circumstances that led to the Great Migration. And to help us with this is where we're going to watch this video from Professor Baldwin. It is about 11 minutes long, and at this point, if you haven't watched it yet, you should. And feel free to pause the video here and do that, because we are going to build on what he discusses. Alright, so now that you've seen his mini lecture, I want to focus on the second prompt that appears after it, which is to identify the major push and pull factors of the movement. And for the purpose of this activity, let's define push factors as any forces or circumstances that prompt a person or people to leave. And let's define pull factors as any forces or circumstances that attract a person or people to a new place. Oh, and just so you know, these aren't limited to studying American history. In fact, you may recognize these terms from your study of global or even another class. Let's start by talking about push factors in a little more depth. What types of things could lead a person to leave the place they are currently living? Unfortunately, oftentimes these circumstances are negatively affecting their well-being or even threatening their safety or livelihoods. And we'll see when we get to pull factors, they are usually positive versions of these same elements, but instead they attract people. So for push factors, sometimes they can be natural disasters such as floods or droughts that occur and make the land uninhabitable or unable to produce crops or serve as grazing land for cattle. As the effects of climate change continue to worsen, I worry that this push factor is going to be a recurring issue for millions of people around the world. One example is the southward spreading of the Sahara Desert, which is leading to increased water insecurity and water scarcity, and it is literally pushing people out of their homes. With nowhere else to immediately go, they might be forced onto land that is already occupied or used by other people, and unfortunately, this has led to conflict. Additionally, some disasters aren't natural, but rather human-made. For instance, war, especially a long-lasting one, is sadly a push factor that we have seen numerous times throughout history. Armed conflicts can push people away for their literal safety and survival. Unfortunately, this remains all too of a common push factor as we have seen people forced out of their homelands, with a fairly current example being due to a civil war in Yemen. Another push factor that is sometimes connected to these, but also definitely occurs independently, is an economic one, meaning employment and income. This could be due to an ongoing depression or recession that forces people to leave and seek employment elsewhere. I mentioned that it could be connected to natural disasters or armed conflicts because when people face these two things, not only could their immediate lives and safety be threatened, but also their ability to provide for themselves or their dependents. It is very difficult to earn a living in a war zone or during a prolonged drought. Another broad category of push factors worth mentioning is instability. Now, this can be either political, such as a military coup, or laws unfairly targeting a minority population, or it could be an example of social instability, such as maybe circumstances exist that actively promote some form of inequality or systemic racism or sexism. One last one I'll mention here is a breakdown of services that people rely on, such as transportation, infrastructure, and telecommunications, which can even include things like medical care and schooling. Unfortunately, this is not a complete list of push factors, but rather common ones that we tend to come across. Regarding pull factors, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes it really could be viewed as being the same element, but its circumstances are different, so they attract people. For instance, when I was elaborating on push factors and I brought up natural disasters such as desertification, if a region has the opposite and it has fertile land, that could be a pull factor. The same is true for employment. If an area is experiencing economic growth, pays higher wages, or has very low unemployment rates, these could definitely be things that pull people towards moving there. Let's now apply this to what Professor Baldwin mentioned in his video lecture. He pointed out that between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million African Americans moved from the South to northern and western states. And since this movement took place within one nation, it's classified as a migration. If this movement was to take place between nations, it would be immigration. He mentioned that one of the push factors leading to this great migration was an insect called the boll weevil that destroyed huge percentages of the cotton crops in the South. And that's going to push African American farmers to cities. And if we were to classify this using our previous categories, this would definitely be an economic factor. Also, these people were being terrorized. This was the time of Jim Crow and complete racial segregation across virtually every aspect of society. In addition, there was white capping that removed African Americans from their land, as well as the horrors of racially motivated violence and lynchings, which were public murders of African Americans. Without a doubt, all these factors were about their safety and security. Some pull factors mentioned by Professor Baldwin that attracted people north were how many factory workers were off fighting World War I, and that led the owners to look south to find their replacements. Also, he mentioned how he saw evidence of people taking these jobs in northern factories and using them as a stepping stone to pursue some other dream or goal they had, which is another factor pulling them to the north. And lastly, he also elaborated on how in the north, it did provide relative safety and security compared to the south. However, by no means was the north without prejudice, systemic racism, and bigotry, but it was a relative improvement. So these are some of the push and pull factors laid out in Professor Baldwin's lecture. If you are continuing with this lesson, you will likely find this useful as you write this short essay question at the end. I would highly recommend you consider these factors as you write about the historical circumstances leading to this event. Also, when you examine the two documents included with this task, keep an eye out for some of those push and pull factors that we discussed here, and be sure to mention them when you are describing the relationship between the two documents. Doing so will definitely strengthen your writing.